Now, reports say at least 4 people have been killed by a drone strike on a residential area of Kyiv as Russian forces attack several Ukrainian cities. Aid workers say an 11-year-old was amongst the wounded. The Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, says Russia has launched more than 20 killer drones, as well as missiles and shells. Now, we have more on the long-running war and fighting strategies in this report.
In the Kherson region, Ukrainian area reconnaissance men are tracking down the occupiers and eliminating them day and night. But the Russians are fighting back, trying to destroy Ukrainian drones as well. It's a familiar picture of war. Dozens of armored vehicles burned, enemy observation posts destroyed. Behind every successful attack is the painstaking work of aerial reconnaissance men, dozens of drone flights, hundreds of hours of observation. In the evening, Ukrainian soldiers prepare for a big job, setting up explosives and other weapons as they try not to underestimate the enemy. After a night of training, the soldiers head to the front line where cannon artillery is fired from both sides. The soldiers quickly set up the drone, fly to their destination, and drop a mortar shell, followed by a 16-kilogram thermobaric charge. The explosion is visible even in a few kilometers from the epicenter. After a successful completion of the mission, the soldiers return to the base to recharge the batteries and prepare new explosives to throw them at the enemy the next night as they desperately wait to clear them off the Ukrainian soil. Meanwhile, the U.S. Pentagon spokesperson, General Patrick Ryder, says the Department of Defense will send tanks to Ukraine faster than originally thought. The Army General says the tanks will make it into Ukraine soon, which will be months ahead of the original estimated time for their arrival in Ukraine. The U.S. originally said it will take a year to get the tanks into Ukraine.
In terms of the significance of the timeline, you've heard us talk in the past about trying to work with Ukraine to meet not only their near-term needs, but their medium-term needs. And so taking territory, retaking territory, as part of any offensive will be important, but as will sustaining those gains at some point in the future, as well as being able to deter future Russian aggression. So this is all part of our broader near-term and longer-term support to Ukraine and their defense requirements.
General Ryder also says the U.S. will train Ukrainian soldiers on the handling of the tanks, but he did not offer details of how the training will go.
Now, for more on the war and international remedies, a broadcaster journalist Kofi Tete joins me now from the United Kingdom. Good to have you join us.
And it's Tete Kofi, if I may say so.
Thank you, Tete Kofi.
That's right.
We know that a lot is happening right now in the UK where you are, but we'll talk about that more later. But let's talk about the visit of President Putin to Mariupol. It's the first time he will be visiting Ukraine since the full-scale invasion began. I want to ask you why Mariupol, and then what is the significance of that visit?
Look, you've got to set the mood and the scene of this Ukrainian conflict properly. Otherwise, the drip, drip, drip of information, which is very dramatic, will make you think that it's something that's a terrible, dogged conflict. Of course, war is an awful thing. If one human life is lost, it's one human life too many. But as George Galloway said very, very appropriately, if Russia had determined to invade Ukraine, the invasion would have been over in one afternoon. This is going to be a war of attrition, and a war based on the Russian war aim of making sure that NATO doesn't sit cheek by jowl with her border, so that you have the specter of nuclear-armed opponents confronting each other. Now, when Russia fell apart in 1991, sorry, when the Soviet Union came apart in 1991, everybody understood that the brightest red line that you could show the Russians was to put themselves in a situation where a NATO country was next door to sovereign Russia. And that's what the Russians are trying to prevent. They don't mind the fact that there is a Western sphere of influence. All they are absolutely certain about is that they're not going to repeat the mistakes they made with Napoleon, the First World War, the Second World War with Hitler, and also with the Japanese way back then in 1939. So that's what this is all about. Mariupol is just another one of these border areas where the push and pull of the war of attrition is going on in that particular conflict.
Now, how right up do you think he is, and I'm talking about President Putin, by the arrest warrant issued by the ICC?
You know, I don't think that he is particularly worried. Let's remember, they issued swinging sanctions against Russian oligarchs and Russia. And what happened? Those sanctions hurt the West far more than they ever hurt Russia. Not only the West, but we outside of the West, say in Africa, started to feel the impact of Europe losing its supply of oil and gas, the world losing its supply of wheat, the world losing its supply of fertilizer, to the point where vegetables now in Western Europe, let me say for England, have gone up in price by 20 to 30%. You won't believe the spectre that as a partial consequence of what's going on many thousands of miles away in Ukraine, sardines are now being rationed in an English supermarket. If you said that about an African country, people would say, that sort of thing happens. But certainly not in a G6 nation.
You have said that, look, the word is the impact of this particular war is being felt more around the world than in Russia. But you don't think that he could be losing support in Ukraine, and that perhaps those in power, his allies in Russia rather, his allies in Russia might begin to see him as a liability with this particular arrest warrant?
I don't think so, for the simple reason that Russia has long been used to various ruses fired off from the West to destabilize the Russian nation. Look, in the Second World War, the Russians lost 27 million people. Most don't know that in 1939, 100,000 troops were involved in the war with Japan. We won't mention what happened with Napoleon. So the Russians have living memory of wars and destabilization of their countries. And so I don't think that the Russians are going to allow themselves to be regime changed by people who in the past, i.e. I'm talking people in the West, who in the past have generally speaking not been the best friends of the Russian people. So long answer short, I would say that I don't think that Putin has been destabilized by activities at the ICC because Russia isn't a third world country. Russia is still something of a superpower.
Let's talk about the commitment made by some countries in Europe, about 18 of them, to supply Ukraine with more weapons, especially artillery shells. How committed do you think, or how long more do you think that this commitment will continue if this war lingers, because there are fears that, look, perhaps the West might grow weary of supplying weapons to Ukraine, especially because its own weapon supplies is also losing, is also beginning to deteriorate as well in the West.
Of course, in this, you're absolutely right. I noticed in your clip before we came on that the Americans have pushed their supply of tanks up the timeline. And of course, as you say just now, more shells are going to have to be sent. Look, you don't send sophisticated modern military equipment without a proper, thorough grounding in their use and deployment by the people who are going to be on the front line. Russia has a massive, well-trained standing army. So it goes back to my point that this is actually a war of attrition. And the whole idea is that if Ukraine joins NATO, the West is going to have a hold over Russia. Does anybody in the West, apart from the Western media, honestly think and believe that the Russians aren't aware of what's going on? In fact, it was President Trump who said that there's something called the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine is America's template for foreign policy. It's been running for about 200 years. And under the Monroe Doctrine, there is a well-placed understanding of something called spheres of influence. And the Americans reserve themselves the right that if any foreign powers threaten their spheres of interest, they will act in their self-defense. Trump said in his last term of office that the Monroe Doctrine is still the template for American policy. Well, actually, the Russians are just applying the Monroe Doctrine only in their own interest. And the Monroe Doctrine is something which many people just don't know the history. It led to the nuclear crisis of 1962, when Kennedy pointed his missiles at Cuba if Khrushchev didn't stand down and remove his missiles from Cuba, which was 15 minutes flying time from the capital of the United States of America. Under the Monroe Doctrine, America has invaded no less than, I would say, a dozen neighboring countries just to make sure that America's influence is retained in North and Southern America. So by the same token, if you creep up with an organization being NATO, which is nuclear armed, right up to the border of Russia, what do you expect the Russians to do but to defend themselves? By the way, there is a template for solving this problem, because Finland, Sweden, Austria are all countries which aren't a part of NATO, specifically for the reason that it is considered a hostile and threatening gesture.
Well, the West continues to say Russia. That, look, every country is sovereign and Ukraine should be allowed to make its own decision. But we'll see how far that goes. Broadcast journalist Tete Kofi, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you.